What exactly does it mean for the government to negotiate prices as opposed to the government just to fix prices? I mean, isn't this just price fixing?
Well, in this example,
what do you think is the right answer if they're the single largest customer, Sachs, right? I mean, and they are the market. I mean, what's the right thing to do?
Well, I mean, you're saying that these drug companies are going to make a lot less money. Well, obviously, that's going to have a downstream impact in the willingness to fund new drugs and new investment, new R&D.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, no one likes pharma companies, so I'm not defending exorbitant profits or whatever, but I don't really know what it means for the government to say they're negotiating. I mean, the government just tells you what it's going to be. That's price fixing. And these companies are going to adjust. Yes, the government will pay less money in the near term. In the long term, there could be reduced investment in R&D.
I think there'll be a balance of,
Don't all governments, Chamath? Don't all governments, I know that you're close to some of these drug companies, don't all governments negotiate the purchase of these drugs, and then if they don't like the price, there are alternative drugs, and they'll say, hey, listen, your drug is too expensive compared to these other two solutions, so we're going to buy this one primarily for our universal health care.
There's this interesting thing that happens, which is that there's these drugs that are proprietary and under patent, okay? These could be chemical drugs or they could be biologics, okay? And eventually what happens is when they go generic, then folks will step in and make lower cost versions of those generics. Like, I'm on a statin. I think a couple of you guys are on a statin. Like, it's Lipitor, but it's not Lipitor, right? It's atorvastatin. It's like some generic drug that I just take, okay, as an example. There's a lot of folks that make that, and the cost of those pills basically go to zero. But there's a bunch of categories, particularly for biologic drugs, where it's very different. It's very difficult to make what's called a biosimilar. This is a generic drug. So long and short of it is there's all these classes of drugs that kind of like stand alone without enough competition. And I think there are two ways to solve this problem. One is where the government steps in, which I think is good. But the better way is already been happening in the United States. So, there's a nonprofit, which is a collective between a bunch of hospitals called Civica. And I think that's a really interesting example. And what those guys do was they said, we're just going to create our own generic drug manufacturer. And we're going to make the drugs we want. We're just going to make them super cheap. And, they're in the midst right now of completing a massive facility. I think it's in Virginia, where they'll be able to make as much insulin as is needed for the entirety of America for no more than $35 a dose.
That's
right?
Gangster.
That's gangster. It's super gangster.
We'll make our own.
And by the way, when California said they're going to make their own, what they really meant was that they're going to go and RFP it out. And my hope is that they end up going with somebody like Civica, who has the experience of actually building it. Otherwise, California's just going to waste hundreds of millions of dollars.
Request for proposal, if you don't know what RFP is. Request for proposal.
Yeah. But there are these emerging nonprofits that are basically doing the work of the government. I think that's a better solution to what Sachs is actually...
Competition, right? Yeah.
It kind of creates competition.
Yeah, competition.